9:30 in the evening, the 17th of March, 2023. A CCTV camera on a quiet street in Lincoln catches a young woman walking past, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She does not look at the camera. She has no reason to. It is an ordinary night in an ordinary part of an ordinary city. Nobody watching that footage back then would have known they were looking at the last confirmed sighting of her, alive, that anyone would ever have. 7 days later, a man walking along the River Witham would stop to look at something floating near the bank, a carrier bag, then another. He would not be able to explain, afterwards, what made him reach into the water that particular afternoon. He would only be able to describe what he found inside. A hand. Behind a door less than 10 miles away, in a flat above a quiet stairwell, a note had been taped up for several days. It explained, politely, that the occupant was isolating. COVID, it said. Nothing to worry about. There was no COVID behind that door. There was something else entirely. And the man who wrote that note knew exactly what it was. This is the story of Nicholas Metson and Holly Bramley. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Holly Bramley was 26 years old. She was one of triplets, born into a close family who would later describe her simply as vibrant. Those who knew her spoke of someone who was rarely seen without a smile. She loved singing and dancing. She had a particular fondness for animals, the kind of person who would stop to fuss over a dog in the street or rescue something small and frightened. Her family remembered her as affectionate, warm, the sort of presence that made a room feel lighter. She adored her younger brothers. She doted on her nieces and nephews. Those who watched her with the children in her family said she lit up around them, and that she had spoken, more than once, about wanting to become a mother herself one day. It was a future she pictured clearly, children of her own, a family she would build. Holly had attended a local support group for people with additional needs. It was there, in 2016, that she met a man named Nicholas Metson. They became a couple. 5 years later, in 2021, they married. To people on the outside looking in, it might have seemed like an ordinary beginning, a couple who had found each other through a shared community, who had been together for years before deciding to marry. What very few people outside that relationship understood was what had been happening, quietly, behind the door of their flat. Holly's family would later describe meeting Nicholas Metson as the start of something else entirely. Not the beginning of a happy marriage, but the beginning of a long road through domestic abuse. They said they tried, as a family, to reach her. They said afterwards that despite everything they did, they could not save her from what was happening inside that relationship. By early 2023, Holly Bramley was a 26-year-old woman with a future she had been imagining out loud to the people who loved her. She did not know how little time she had left to imagine it. Nicholas Metson was 28 years old. Like Holly, he had attended that same local support group, which is where the two of them had first crossed paths back in 2016. On the surface, there was little to distinguish him. He lived an unremarkable life in Lincoln, in a flat, at a building called Shuttleworth House. To casual acquaintances, he may simply have looked like a young husband, recently married, going about an ordinary existence. But Nicholas Metson's history did not begin with Holly Bramley, and it was not as clean as it might have appeared. Court records would later confirm that he had previous convictions for offences against former partners dating back to 2013, 2016, and 2017. In other words, before he ever married Holly, there was already an established pattern: multiple women, multiple years, multiple convictions. This is a detail worth sitting with. It means the behavior that would eventually destroy Holly's life was not new. It was not a one-off loss of control, a single bad year in an otherwise stable man. It was a pattern that had already shown itself repeatedly before Holly ever said yes to marrying him in 2021. Inside the relationship, according to Holly's family, that pattern continued. They would later describe his behavior using two specific terms: coercive and controlling. These are not vague accusations. Coercive control is a recognized pattern in cases of domestic abuse, referring to a sustained effort by one partner to dominate and restrict another, often through isolation, intimidation, financial control, or the gradual cutting off of outside relationships. That is precisely what Holly's family say happened to her. They said his controlling behavior left them unable to see Holly in the years before her death. Not for one occasion, for years. A daughter, a sister, increasingly cut off from the people who loved her most, by the man she had married. By the start of 2023, the marriage had reached its end. The relationship, in the words later used in court, had broken down irretrievably. Holly and Nicholas were on the verge of separating. It is into that moment, a marriage already collapsing, a man with a documented history of controlling behavior towards the women in his life, that the events of March 2023 would unfold. The early months of 2023 found Holly Bramley and Nicholas Metson at a breaking point. The marriage that had begun 2 years earlier was ending, and by all accounts, it was ending badly. What exactly passed between them in those final days has never been fully explained, not even by Metson himself. There was no note left behind detailing grievances, no witness account of a final, explosive argument. What there is, instead, is a trail of digital evidence that paints a picture of a man who had already begun planning for what would come after. In the days surrounding Holly's death, searches were made on Metson's devices. Among them, how to dispose of a body. Among them too, a stranger and more unsettling search, whether someone could be haunted by a person after they had died. These are not the searches of a man caught in a sudden, unplanned moment of violence with no idea what to do next. Taken together with everything that follows, they suggest a level of premeditated thinking about concealment that sits alongside, or perhaps even precedes, the act itself. Holly was last seen on CCTV on the 17th of March, 2023. In the days immediately afterwards, instead of any report of her missing, what emerged was a carefully constructed story. A note appeared on the door of their flat, explaining that the resident was self-isolating due to COVID. A takeaway order, previously arranged, was cancelled. Messages began to circulate, sent by Metson, claiming that Holly had left him. It would later emerge that some of these messages went further still. Metson had accessed Holly's own social media accounts and used them to send messages in her name, implying that she had walked out of the marriage of her own accord, alleging that she had been violent towards him, and even arranging a transfer of money to himself, framed as a form of apology from her. This was not panic, this was construction, a version of events, built piece by piece, designed to explain Holly's absence without anyone needing to ask where she actually was. It would not hold for long. On the 24th of March, 2023, Lincolnshire police received a call. Someone had raised concerns for Holly Bramley's welfare. Officers were dispatched to the flat at Shuttleworth House the following day. The first 2 times they knocked, there was no answer. On the third attempt, Nicholas Metson opened the door. He told the officers he did not know where his wife was. He said she had mental health problems, that she had self-harmed, and that she had subjected him to domestic abuse. He showed them a bite mark on his forearm as evidence. He claimed she had left the property on the 19th of March with a local mental health support group. At one point during the search of the flat, Metson made a joke. He suggested that Holly might be hiding under the bed. The officers noticed several things that did not fit his account. A strong smell of ammonia and bleach hung in the air. There were dark, blood-stained sheets in the bathtub. A towel lay on the kitchen floor. The flat showed clear signs of recent redecoration and cleaning, the kind of urgent, thorough cleaning that does not typically follow an argument between a couple, but does typically follow something far worse. Police would later establish, through forensic reconstruction, what they believed had taken place inside that flat roughly a week earlier. Holly had most likely been stabbed multiple times in the bedroom. Large bloodstains were later found on the bedroom floor, confirmed to be hers. From there, her body had been moved to the bathroom, where Metson used a variety of different tools to dismember it. A set of garden pruners, 2 knives, and a claw hammer were later seized from the flat, all of them connected to what had happened there. Once the dismemberment was complete, Metson kept the remains hidden inside the flat itself, in the kitchen larder, for nearly a week. For days, he lived alongside what he had done, sending messages to people about his wife having left him, while her body remained, concealed, only meters away. In the early hours of the 25th of March, Metson contacted a friend, Joshua Hancock, offering him money for a job. The following day, a message on Hancock's phone read, "Just got £50 for disposing of a body." CCTV footage later recovered by police showed Metson moving bags out of the flat. Some were carried by hand, others were loaded into a Morrison's shopping trolley. From there, they were transferred into his yellow Peugeot car and driven roughly 10 miles to the village of Bassingham, where the bags were disposed of in the River Witham. The following day, the 25th of March, a member of the public walking near the river noticed several shopping bags, along with a reusable bag for life, floating in the water. He stopped to examine one. Inside, he found a severed human hand. Police divers were sent to search the river. In total, they recovered 224 separate remains belonging to Holly Bramley. Some parts of her body, including portions of her heart, her lungs, and several fingers, were never found. A forensic pathologist would later spend more than 13 hours examining what had been recovered. Because of the extent of the damage to her remains, it was not possible to determine an exact cause of death. What could be confirmed was that Holly had suffered multiple stab wounds. This case rested on 3 distinct categories of evidence, each one closing off a different avenue of denial available to the man responsible. The first was physical evidence recovered directly from the flat. The bloodstains in the bedroom matched Holly. The tools seized, garden pruners, knives, a claw hammer, were consistent with the kind of injuries later identified on her remains. The smell of ammonia and bleach, combined with visible signs of fresh redecoration, told its own story to investigators experienced in recognizing the aftermath of an attempted cleanup. The second category was digital evidence. This proved central to the case. The internet searches conducted in the days around Holly's death, how to dispose of a body, whether the dead can haunt the living, established a timeline of intent that words alone could not. Messages sent from Metson's own phone, alongside messages sent from Holly's hacked accounts, created a documented record of deliberate deception built and maintained over several days. Phone evidence also captured the financial exchange with Joshua Hancock, including the message confirming payment for disposing of a body. In court, this kind of digital trail carries particular weight because it does not rely on memory or interpretation. It is a direct, time-stamped record of what a person searched for, said, and arranged, in their own words, at the time. The third category was forensic pathology. Despite the severity of the dismemberment, which prevented an exact cause of death from being established, the pathologist was still able to confirm multiple stab wounds on the recovered remains. This mattered because it anchored the case to an act of direct violence, rather than leaving open any ambiguity about how Holly had died. Together, these three strands, physical, digital, and forensic, removed any realistic path to a defense built on accident, self-defense, or a sudden, unplanned act. Metson initially denied murder. Faced with the combined weight of this evidence, he later changed his plea to guilty. It is worth stating clearly, before going further, that nothing here is intended as a clinical diagnosis. No psychologist examined Nicholas Metson and gave evidence in this case about a specific disorder. What follows is drawn directly from the established facts, the documented pattern of behavior, and how that pattern is generally understood within research on coercive control and domestic homicide. The first thing to understand is that this did not begin in 2023. Metson's convictions for offences against former partners, stretching back to 2013, mean that the behaviour which ended Holly's life was not an isolated event. Researchers who study domestic abuse consistently point to this kind of repeated pattern across multiple relationships as one of the clearest warning signs of an underlying need for control, rather than a problem specific to any one partner or any one argument. The second element is the coercive control described by Holly's own family, the years in which they were kept from seeing her. Isolating a partner from their family is one of the most well-documented tactics in abusive relationships. It is rarely framed, by the person doing it, as control. It is framed as love, as protection, as simply wanting time together. But its function is to narrow a victim's world until the abuser becomes the only voice they regularly hear. The third element is what happened after Holly's death, and this is, in many ways, the most striking part of the psychological picture. A person who kills in a single moment of panic, with no further thought, behaves very differently afterwards to a person who methodically dismembers a body, conceals it inside their own kitchen for nearly a week, continues to message people pretending nothing has happened, searches the internet for guidance on disposal, and eventually pays someone else to help finish the job. That sequence speaks to a capacity for sustained, calculated deception that continued for days, not minutes. Finally, there is the detail the judge himself highlighted as significant. Metson never offered any account of why he killed Holly or how the violence began. In many domestic homicide cases, even where the act itself is indefensible, an offender will offer some kind of explanation, however inadequate, a final argument, an act of self-defense, a moment of provocation. The absence of any explanation here was treated by the court as an aggravating feature in itself, a final refusal to give Holly's family even the smallest understanding of what had happened to her. Most coverage of this case understandably focused on its most visceral detail, the dismemberment, the river, the 224 recovered pieces. It is the detail that makes headlines, but it is worth pausing on a different angle, one that says more about how this kind of abuse is allowed to continue unseen. Holly Bramley and Nicholas Metson met through a support group for people with additional needs. That detail matters, not because it explains anything about what Metson did, but because it highlights something uncomfortable about coercive control. It does not require a victim to be naive, or unsupported, or unaware of warning signs in the abstract. Holly had a close family. She had siblings who loved her. She was, by every account, a sociable, affectionate, emotionally engaged person. And still, her family say, they were systematically kept away from her for years. This is precisely the mechanism that makes coercive control so difficult to interrupt from the outside. It does not announce itself. There is rarely a single visible injury that prompts a neighbor to call the police. No obvious public incident in the years beforehand. Instead, it operates through a slow narrowing, fewer visits, fewer calls, plausible excuses, until a family that once saw their daughter regularly finds itself shut out entirely, with no single moment they can point to as the turning point. Holly's family have been open about this. They have said, directly, that they tried and that they could not save her. That admission carries weight precisely because it resists a simple narrative. This was not a case of a family failing to notice anything was wrong. It was a case of a family noticing and still being unable to break through the isolation that had been deliberately built around her. In April 2024, at Lincoln Crown Court, Nicholas Metson was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Holly Bramley, with a minimum term of 19 years and 316 days to be served before he can even be considered for release by the parole board. A further sentence of 4 years for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice will run alongside it. Joshua Hancock, who helped dispose of Holly's remains without knowledge that a murder had taken place, was sentenced to 3 years and 3 months in prison, along with a 10-year sexual harm prevention order relating to separate offences. His Honour Judge Simon Hurst told Metson directly that Holly's family and friends would never know exactly how or why she was killed. It was, the judge said, an aggravating feature of the case that Metson never offered any explanation at all. In her victim impact statement, Holly's mother, Annette Bramley, described the man her daughter had married as an evil monster and told him he had subjected their family to what amounted to a life sentence of grief of their own. She said the way Holly had been killed, and what had been done to her afterwards, had left the family in a kind of pain that was almost impossible to put into words. But outside the courtroom, in the statements her family chose to share, there was a deliberate effort to make sure Holly was remembered as more than the details of how she died. Her sister, Sarah Jane Lindop, spoke instead of her love of singing and dancing, her passion for animals, the smile she rarely went without, and the way she adored her younger brothers and her nieces and nephews. She spoke of a young woman who had wanted, more than anything, to become a mother herself one day. Sarah Jane's final words to the press, after sentencing, were these. She said, that day was by no means closure, but it was, she said, a milestone in the process of their grief and in their healing. If you want to understand how investigators build a case like this, piece by piece, from CCTV footage, deleted messages, and forensic evidence recovered from a riverbed, this channel covers cases just like it every week. Subscribe to follow along and to help us keep telling stories like Holly's with the care and accuracy they deserve. Thank you for watching.